this rainy night. It's always good to see people coming out. And we have quite an interesting series of artist talks this fall. We had one, some of you came to Marie Alber's talk about architecture and design, and Laura Dutton is tonight. And then next week we have Craig Sibley from Trench Contemporary Art. It's a new art gallery in Vancouver that opened. It's about 1.5 years old. So he's an artist and a gallery director. And then on November 30th, we have Val Nelson, a painter from Vancouver. So just stay tuned, they'll be in the newsletters. And we're able to do this in part because of a grant we received from the BC Arts Council, so it's great. And I think it's really such an interesting process to hear an artist talk about their work. And Laura Dutton, we're pleased to present her tonight. She teaches at ExhibitVic right now, and she graduated from Concordia in Montreal, and she did her MFA at University of Victoria. And it was really, I loved going through your website to see how your work goes from photography to video and installations and sculpture, and how a lot of your sculptural installations look like paintings, and some of your photographs look like paintings, and then the photographs of sculptures. And I thought it's really interesting, that kind of interweaving of all the different disciplines. So I'm excited to hear more about your work. And I know most of you know me. I'm Wendy, the director of the school. So keep coming to our talks, and welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is sort of my first artist talk, so thank you for coming out.
Thanks for admitting that, Laura.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous.
Do you need a light?
No, I'm okay like
this. We have a little computer light.
Okay, I think I'm okay like this. Thanks. Yeah, so I was sort of debating where to start with my work. After my first experience with post-secondary art study was at a place called the University College of the Fraser Valley, which is in Abbotsford. And I went there for about 3 years, kind of part-time, off and on, taking a lot of art history courses and some painting and photography courses. So that's kind of what really sort of solidified my desire to go to do my undergrad work. So I moved to Montreal in 2003 and started my undergrad program there with a major in photography. So I think I'll start there with the first series I did while I was at that school, which is this series, which I just called A Place. And it's from 2003, and they're just small black and white 5-inch by 5-inch prints. At the time, I was working a lot with a Holga camera. I'm not sure if you know what this is. They're pretty popular now. You can get them at like Chapters and clothing stores, but at the time they were sort of a little bit more rare. I had to order them, and they're just a simple toy camera. It's like a plastic body with a really simple spring that flips around to release the shutter. So you really can't control anything. There's no light meter, there's no real lens or focusing system. It's a very simple camera. So I was working with these and sort of modifying them. So I was buying a bunch of them and sort of opening them up and drilling tripod mounts into them and fixing the shutter so that I could have longer exposures. And it was sort of an interesting process because I became sort of attached to these toy cameras and felt very kind of in tune with them. So this was the first series I did, and it took place just after my grandfather passed away, and I had to take a train from Montreal to St. Mary's, Ontario for the funeral. And I was feeling sort of displaced, and I decided to do this series of work based on kind of how I was feeling, sort of the journey, my headspace, but not the actual event itself. And I felt like this toy camera I was using at the time sort of played a key role in this because it's very light, and it's very non-intrusive. You kind of click the shutter and there's this quiet little click, and it became sort of meditative, I thought, and so I found that sort of interesting. I don't think I could have done this work with a heavy SLR camera or something like that with a heavy contraption. I really needed this kind of simplicity. So I started working with this camera quite a lot. If you guys have any questions during the talk, just let me know.
So did you print all these yourself?
I did. Yeah, they were all printed in the darkroom on fiber paper and just framed in little black frames. They were quite small and sort of precious feeling.
What's your film?
This was, oh gosh, it's so long ago. The Holga camera takes a medium format film, so it was 120 film, and it was probably just HP5, like 400 or something. This was pretty forgiving. This series of work was the first time I had worked with color photography. Concordia has a pretty extensive photography program, and they have a big fancy color darkroom. And so this was my first taste of color photography, which is quite a different thing. But I decided that I was going to continue using these plastic toy cameras. And at the time, it was sort of a bit of a struggle because a lot of students were kind of defining very specific subject matters and going out and shooting them in a very sort of methodical way. But I was having trouble with this, and I was sort of just more interested in sort of mundane, everyday moments, taken in a way that seems sort of subjective. So I think the Holga lends itself to that too, because you always kind of get this sense that you're looking in on a kind of an intimate moment or something. This vignetting that happens around the sides always makes it seem like you're kind of looking through a peephole or through a window or something. So I began photographing these sort of random scenes or objects or landscapes and printing them in the color darkroom, and then playing around with the placement of them after, starting to group them and pair them according to sort of an intuitive notion of them creating some sort of dialogue between each other, rather than having sort of a definite subject matter. I was sort of basing this on a feeling. And I'm showing this series mostly because I think I still work this way today quite a bit. This sense of going out and shooting, and then afterwards taking a step back and looking at how the images are sort of speaking with one another. This series was from 2004, and it's a bit of a departure with how I normally approach photographs, but after my grandfather had died, I got a few boxes of things that he had in his basement, and they were basically like documents and keepsakes, but I was totally amazed with these objects. There were passports and food stamps, newspaper clippings, insurance papers, birth and death certificates, photographs, postcards. He was a Shriner, so there was a Mason handbook, which was really interesting, and jewelry and badges and so on. And so I found these things sort of amazing because they didn't just refer to his life, but also to his parents, to his grandparents, and to distant relatives from England who I'd never heard of before. So all of a sudden I had all these kind of artifacts, and I decided that I wanted to approach this project sort of forensically. Like I wanted to let the physicality of these objects sort of speak, rather than trying to build a narrative. So I wanted to sort of take a step back and look at these objects in a way that was maybe a little bit disconnected emotionally. And I was fascinated with what people keep throughout their life, but also that these things ended up in my hands, because some of the documents seemed quite important. There were a lot of letters, and it didn't make a huge, it didn't matter to me that you could or could not read them in the photographs. I was more interested in sort of studying the physical forms.
So how did you present these photographs?
So these were, I didn't use a camera, I just scanned the objects directly on a flatbed scanner. And they were printed on matte paper, but the quality of, like, the detail you pick up on a flatbed scanner is really amazing. So you can see all these kind of fibers and stuff sticking out of the papers, and They became really physical, like you could almost imagine picking them up. So I just printed them on 8x10 paper and then presented them in a little, like an archival box.
Oh, okay.
So it sort of became like a two-dimensional version of the actual box of objects.
And were they on the wall?
No,
Okay.
I kind of just put them on a plinth and there were gloves and people could sort of rummage through the images
Oh, okay.
through the
Like
box.
how they might appear in a museum.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
If they were scanned, how do the papers look like they're not pressed flat?
Well, because some of them were quite big objects. Like this, for example, was a full like picture frame. So I just put them on the flatbed scanner and then put a box over the flatbed scanner rather than close the lid. So if there's an object that's quite deep, it gets blurred quite easily because the scanner doesn't have a lot of depth of field, right? It just scans what's directly on the surface, but it sort of was interesting what happened.
That's such a good idea, the box. What do you call the scanner again?
It's just a flatbed scanner, like when you would, yeah, like if you would scan papers directly on a scanner, one of those. Yeah, I wanted to avoid having to squish anything down. I think it would have changed the project
Right,
a little bit.
yeah.
So.
A lot of them will actually let you take the lid right out.
Yeah,
They just have like pins holding them in the back, so when you lift the lid, it'll just pop out.
exactly.
You just put a box in.
Yeah.
Cool.
Or you could put something like, you can even just put a piece of foam core on top of the object and just have, it scan a white background or something like that. Yeah, it was interesting because some of these objects were literally kind of falling apart in my hands. They were sort of disintegrating from time, so it was interesting to have this photographic record of them. Just have to look at my notes so I can remember dates here. So, okay, this is a series I just titled Untitled Black and White series. I'm not great with titles and I don't place a lot of importance on them, so most of my work ends up being untitled. But this is a black and white series I did in a 4x5 class, so it's one of those photography classes where you use the old large format camera and you have a big sheet that goes over your head and you look at the ground glass and the image is upside down. So the process was really interesting, and 4x5 negatives contain obviously a considerable amount of information, much more than a small negative. So I was sort of interested in the idea of taking this process that could give you a huge amount of detail and just photographing things that don't have a lot of detail or a lot of information, so kind of these sort of minimal spaces. And the funny story is that I was in Montreal at the time and I had this idea that I wanted to go to New Brunswick. I'd never been there. And I wanted to photograph the Bay of Fundy, and I had this vision in my head that I was just going to take these very sort of minimal shots of the horizon and the water. And so I drove all the way out there in a rainstorm with a friend who helped me while I was on the beach setting up this really cumbersome camera, and she's holding a tarp over my head, and it was just a disaster. And I got 3 shots out of the whole trip and returned and showed my my prof at school, and he told me to look up Hiroshi Sugimoto's work, who I didn't know at the time, and he did this series of seascapes, which is sort of exactly what I was thinking in my mind, this simple horizon, and I looked it up and immediately fell in love with his work and abandoned my idea, because I was like, nobody's going to do it better than that. So I started to look to almost more domestic spaces for this idea.
In that stage, you stopped pairing your pictures
I-
together?
I didn't pair these, but I had, I didn't know if I would or not, but when I finally got them printed and on the wall, they seemed to work best just in a kind of linear fashion. That's how I ended up displaying them. They're about 24 by 24 inches, and I just had them mounted on foam core. And I take a lot of images of windows. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's sort of a reoccurring theme in my work. And I printed these digitally actually. I scanned the 4x5 negative and printed these out digitally. This is a series of works that I call the Fractured Panoramics, and they're from 2005, and they're sort of a big series for me. I was quite involved in this. It took up most of my second year at Concordia. So again, I'm working with the Holga camera, and I've always sort of been interested in this idea of fracturing spaces or fracturing images. And so I decided to use a toy camera again, and a lot of cameras advance automatically to the next frame, but the Holga you have to advance manually. So I started taking these sort of panoramic images where I would just intuitively advance the film to what I thought would be a good spot for the images to overlap, but I wouldn't be sure. It was all sort of trial and error. And I went around taking these panoramic images. I developed the negatives, which would end up being long negatives, and then I would just make contact prints from them, so tiny little contact prints. And I shot for an entire semester, and I think I had about 70 or so contact prints, and then I decided on 8 that I thought would work as a series, and I scanned the negatives and printed them digitally. So they're quite large. They're about 8 feet long, and about 44 inches wide, up to 8 feet long, I think. So these spaces that I've shown you so far are the interior of the CCA in Montreal, which is the Architecture Museum. They have this really beautiful interior, and they let me go in and take some images. So you can see, for example, here where the shots overlap. So most of these images are 2 or 3. Handheld, yeah. Thanks. This is at McGill University. They have a really nice campus, so this was one of the buildings that they had on campus. So I was sort of interested in how these pieces reference their own process a little bit, and reference the medium of photography, sort of talking about what's in the frame and what's out of the frame. And as a final series, the 8 that were printed kind of had a connection to these sort of dualities of light and dark and inside and outside and here and there, and those are all themes that I think sort of run through my work. And this is sort of also where I started to become more interested in the idea of creating an atmosphere. And at the scale that they were printed, they became a little bit atmospheric, and I started to think about video and photographs that could sort of encompass a space. Okay, well, I'll show you some videos. This was one of my first attempts at a video, and I didn't really know what I was doing yet with video, but I was interested in the idea of, maybe approaching video like as if it was a moving photograph. So this is just a simple shot that's mirrored, and it just kind of plays out and then loops again. So it's pretty simple, but it's sort of got the ball rolling in terms of how I wanted to approach video. Sorry?
What program did you use?
I can't remember exactly for this one, but for everything else I've done, it's just been a Final Cut Pro, and I just had a basic tutorial at school, and it was pretty simple. So I made a few of these, kind of little, miniature videos that just sort of run like this to start off, and then I tried to approach more, complicated imagery. That piece always kind of reminds me of like a Warshop test, getting a block test. Oh, this is another video. And I'll just let this one run for a bit and then I'll talk about it a little bit. It has no sound. I was too scared to use sound yet. So as I said, windows are kind of a reoccurring theme throughout my work, and at this point this project I was doing during a time-based video class, and so I was thinking about time and the window and light and how light changes, and so I was sort of trying to capture the passage of light via a window, and so I was taking these time-lapse videos of different windows. And I was thinking that I was just going to present them as a straight shot from, morning till night of the light changing. But what ended up happening was I sort of started to play around with them as almost as if they were like music notes in a score. And they were presented large, two windows on each wall. So I had them presented in a room, and 3 walls in the room had windows on them. The light from the windows really started to affect the space and how the space felt, and I thought that was interesting. So yeah, this idea of the window as kind of a symbol of liminality, like this border between inside and outside, here and there, has always been of interest to me. And while I was at Concordia, I read this book called Faking Death, by Penny Cousineau-Levine, and it's basically the first book that sort of tries to give a cohesive identity to Canadian photography. And this book really resonated with me, and I sort of realized that I had been working with many of the themes that she talks about as being very quintessentially Canadian themes. And so those being like an obsession with photographing windows or portals, and this idea that a lot of Canadian photography captures a subject which is sort of in between or absent, and she associates that with our national identity and kind of contrasts it with the American obsession with the monolith. And there are a lot of American photographers, like maybe Edward Weston, you can think of his big peppers, and it's this kind of object that's centrally framed. And so a lot of the things that she was talking about in her book sort of spoke to me, and I could see it reflected in my work. So it's always kind of been there in the background. And her book was a little bit controversial, I think. I mean, she takes some big leaps and makes some big claims. And not all of which I sort of relate to, but many of which I kind of see the thread running through my work. So I might stop it there. Just move on a little bit. And this was a program, I know a lot of cameras these days I think have time-lapse programs built into them, but this was just a free program I found online, and it was like a time-lapse program that hooked up to my camera, and so I would just run the video through my computer, and it would capture, say, 1 frame every 2 seconds or something like that, and that's how the time-lapse video was made. Okay, so this was just a series of images that were kind of, I call them the lost images. I made them in 2007, but I don't know when they were taken because over the span of my undergrad degree, I had just kind of accumulated a pile of, rolls of film that I had taken but had never developed. And so one day I got them developed, and I noticed a kind of, I noticed something connecting them all. I felt like they all were very ephemeral images, kind of speaking of time passing, and I thought that was sort of appropriate. So I printed a small series of them. And I can tell, obviously, these were taken with Holga cameras, and I just don't know when. It would have been during my undergrad degree, I'm sure, but I just thought it was interesting to look back on images that were kind of forgotten. This was my final piece at Concordia. I had done some other video work that I haven't showed you that I thought was maybe less successful, but this was my my first attempt at using sound, and I think it was an attempt to encompass the space with both sound and video. So I think it's about 5 or 6 minutes long, and I'll just play it, but the sound will probably be quite quiet because it's just going to come out of my laptop. Actually, maybe if I play it in VLC, it'll be louder. Sorry, bear with me. That's jumpy. Sorry. Let me see if I can correct that. My laptop's kind of dying. Sorry. Hang on one sec. It can't handle more than a couple programs being open at once.
5 sections, are these spliced together?
No, I was sort of adopting the same format that I had for the panoramic series that I showed you before, the black and white series. And so, again, I was interested in this idea of fracturing space. So I took the video, with the photographs I was fracturing the space without knowing what it was going to look like, right? So I was advancing the film only partially. And in this project, I was taking the video footage in one shot and then fracturing it afterwards into 3 sections, which I then overlapped. So it was kind of connected to that other series, but the way of working was a little bit backwards.
So this is all one piece of film originally?
It's all one piece of videotape, yeah, originally. And so I just imported the video into the computer and sectioned off 3 images from each one image. Yeah. It was sort of interesting to work with sound in this fashion as well, because I spliced the sound as well and kind of had them attached to each video. So when the frames flicker in and out, the sound kind of acts as almost a trigger for that. And so I thought that was interesting, but I still have problems working with sound. It's not my forte, but I enjoyed it for this. And when I presented it, I had this video projected large on a wall, and there were surround sound speakers, and it was quite loud and overwhelming. And a couple people said they felt sick because it's moving, yeah. And the plain footage in the middle was, I got a bit queasy editing it. Right, so that was kind of my last project at Concordia, and then I moved to Japan for a year. And when I came back, I moved to Vancouver, and I had forgotten about this footage I took while I was in Japan. I was living up north in the city of Sapporo, and they get an awful lot of snow, and I wasn't used to it. So I guess I had taken this footage at some point. I kind of forgot I did it, but when I started my MFA studies at ExhibitVic, I needed to kind of do something lighthearted. I don't know, I think I was testing the waters a little bit. So I made this icicle video, which is just footage of me and my partner knocking down the icicles on our house. But what was sort of interesting to me was the idea of creating a loop that wouldn't end. So we go to the end of the house, each of us, and when we get to the end, the video reverses and plays backwards, so we put back up the icicles. And it just keeps going back and forth, but because the 2 videos are sort of independent of each other and they have different running times, the longer it runs, the more out of sync they get with each other. I remember having to do this a few times during the winter. The sound was okay. I didn't have to do anything to the sound, which made it great. I'll just fast forward a little bit and show you what it looks like when it's going backwards, but I won't make you watch the whole thing, it's quite long.
You're much faster than you are.
I know.
Just doing the bigger icicle.
Yeah.
More dangerous.
Yeah, sure. That is great. Good thing we have to drink.
sound backwards too?
The sound is backwards too. So it just keeps going, of course. And I thought the interesting thing was the time element becoming more and more out of sync. I was sort of interested in this, the process of making a video that maybe never ends. Okay. Thank you. So this work is probably one of the more involved pieces I think I've ever done, and I called it migration, and it sort of it certainly took up most of my time at ExhibitVic. I worked on and off on this video installation, and then it also sort of spawned the other work that I did while I was doing my MFA studies. And I ended up presenting this piece and two others, which I'll show you as my thesis work at the end of the year. So, well, maybe I'll just run. It's a silent video loop. And it plays a little bit jumpy on my computer, and I'm not quite sure why. It should be totally smooth, but anyway, so I was interested in creating, again, this loop, this kind of idea of a video that doesn't end. And I initially wanted to create a large-scale installation of people walking, and so I began looking for scenarios that I thought were sort of interesting. And I ended up finding this footage. There's a SkyTrain station in Vancouver, and there's an overhead walkway that connects the Broadway and Commercial SkyTrain station. And people catch their trains at one of the, oh, it's quite jumpy here, sorry about that. But after they get off a train, they walk across this walkway to the other station. So I filmed them walking and cut out the trains in the background, and then kind of cut and pasted all of these pieces of video footage. It's just one piece of video footage for about 10 minutes, but it's just copied and pasted and moved around to, I kind of felt like I was making a quilt when I was putting this all together.
What makes them disappear?
They're layered again. So each piece of footage is maybe about this long, and so they're kind of overlapping at a certain point. Here you can see people getting less silhouette-y, like they get sort of more ghost-like at these overlapping points, and so they're all kind of just weaved together.
Seems to be mostly in the center.
Yeah, they overlap at different points too. Oh, thank you. So I was just interested in, again, this idea of windows. I think that's present here, and an interest in borders, fractures, light, and I think most importantly, this idea of how we see and experience images. And the thing that I found interesting about this video when I had it installed in a room is that it seemed to have some capacity to evolve the longer you sit with it. It starts to kind of change, and sort of relates to your body when you're standing in front of it, and if you walk up closely you can see your silhouette in it, and so these kinds of things sort of interested me. And I like the idea that these people were sort of in an in-between space themselves. They're going to or coming from another place, and this walkway isn't really a destination. It's sort of this transient area. So I kept exploring this kind of imagery. So people walking with this sort of intent to create a big installation that would sort of reference how we see and how we move and how we experience images subjectively. And so I started to film other scenarios that I thought were interesting. I'll maybe just show you quickly, but none of them really work to the same capacity. This one, this is just at breakwater. So I filmed this for a really long time, and it's interesting how videos can sort of dictate their own space. Like the other one works really well when it's projected large, right to the borders of a wall, and it kind of takes up the whole wall. And this one does not. It needed to be projected quite small, so in an actual space, I would actually project it maybe a third of the size it is right here. So I had friends help me make kind of a little podium to house a projector, and we put it almost, just a couple feet away from the wall, so that it ends up being almost like a little photograph hanging on the wall that just moves slowly. And from this footage, I started to play around and get sort of tricky with editing, and it never works out for me quite that way, but I started making imagery that was kind of like this, and I was sort of thinking about it in the same way as I was that window video, kind of moving things around like notes in a score, but in the end I think I dismissed this work from the series. It just never gelled. It's never quite worked the way I wanted it to work. And so all of a sudden I stumbled upon this other footage that I had taken before I started my work at ExhibitVic. When I was living in Vancouver, I was living near Trout Lake, and there's this huge murder of crows that flies in the evening around dusk to Burnaby every night to sleep. It's a really strange thing, and if they fly over East Van, and it's apparently it's been that way for years. So I filmed them one night at dusk flying over my house, and then just layered the video footage to kind of disrupt their direction a little bit. And I went back and looked at this video and realized that I was doing the same thing here that I was doing with the walking people, the first video that I showed you of the SkyTrain station walking. And I felt like they really connected in some way. So I put them beside each other, and they sort of instantly became a diptych. So this piece is presented on one wall, sort of medium size, kind of how it is now. And on the adjacent wall is the walking video. And they create sort of a strange push and pull. You can. I'm sorry I don't have a video footage of them both playing at the same time, but it's very strange when they're both playing, because one will kind of pull you in a direction, and then when you think you're done with it, you sort of go back to the other, and there's this strange tension that happens. And then they also start to mirror each other. I didn't even notice this until I put the two videos next to each other, but the walking video has birds in it too that fly by every once in a while. So every once in a while you catch this moment where they're kind of mimicking each other, which is very strange. So I was continuously working on this video piece while I was doing some print work at ExhibitVic as well. So ExhibitVic has no color darker, but they did have this really strange little tube machine that was supposed to be used for color processing, but I'd never seen one before. It's really sort of basic. It's just a bath, like a little bath, and you put your chemicals in there to keep them sort of regulated temperature. And you load your exposed paper in complete darkness, because it's not like a black and white darkroom where you can have a safe light on. It has to be completely dark. And you roll your paper into a tube, and then you attach this tube to a machine and turn the lights on, and then this tube spins around, and you pour the chemicals in. And it's very sort of hands-on and strange, but nobody had used it in years, and they said I could try and fix it up. And so I got it working, and I ordered chemicals from what seemed like the end of the earth to get these color chemicals, but I finally got them. And I knew that because this process was sort of primitive, like it wasn't going to give me perfect images. I was never going to get, color corrected images. I could never do portraiture or landscape and do it well. So I started just immediately working with kind of abstract light experiments. So these are literally just pieces of photo paper that I took in the darkroom and shone a flashlight on, and then developed. And sometimes I would develop a piece and dry it, and then use that piece as a negative for another one. So if you just put, like a paper negative, so if you just put this image on top of an unexposed sheet of paper, shine light on it, then this image will transfer through to the other sheet and give you an opposite. So I started playing around with that idea, and I don't have very many images of them because they really don't photograph well, but I was sort of starting to think about the materiality of photography, and at the time I was reading a lot of Roland Barthes writing on photography, and he's always talking about this idea of the referent. The photography can never really escape its referent, what it references. You know, it's, you look at a photograph and you're transported to this place and whatever it's referencing. And I sort of wanted to grapple with the idea of making the photograph about the material of the photograph. And then I went to, you know, the fireworks show in Vancouver every summer. The Festival of Light. So I've been going to that for years, and I'm always way more interested in these people watching the fireworks show from their apartment buildings, because there's always this great quality of light coming from the windows, and they look so fantastic. So I went to the fireworks show and forgot my tripod mount, and I was going to take these images of these buildings, which I did, but they were quite low resolution and blurry because I forgot some of my equipment. But I took these images, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I knew that I liked these silhouettes and these windows. So I took the images and put them on the computer, and they were usually of an entire building or of a cityscape, and I just zoomed in on an individual window, enlarged it, and then printed it out on a transparency sheet. And then I cut out all of these individual windows and cut and paste them onto big sheets of plexiglass. Sort of again making a kind of quilt. That's what I felt like I was doing anyways. And then I put lights behind them. And at first I started working with them like this, almost as if they were buildings on their own, like I was making new buildings. But in the end I ended up putting them together. I made 5, and I sort of put them together. I like this idea of them sort of acting like a light curtain. And I guess, you know, they're not a traditional light box in the sense that they don't have a side or a back. If you go up to them, you can see the equipment behind them. So I kind of like this idea of, you know, recreating these buildings, but having them sort of be like facade, like a facade or a veil, like it can't quite hide what's behind it. And this was sort of another way for me to work with light and continue my interest in light. And again, the idea recurs of, you know, obviously the window, but also this idea of these people sort of inhabiting a liminal space, one that is, it's not inside, it's not outside, it's not public or private, it kind of hovers in this weird spot in between. And so I was interested in that. And they're also kind of voyeuristic in the sense that, you know, they didn't know I was taking their image. I'm taking an image of a kind of partial private space. But they're not voyeuristic in the sense that, like, we can't gain any clues here. They're not descriptive enough to really give us an idea of who these people are. They're sort of just more suggestive. They look blurry in the image. They're actually blurry in real life. All the images kind of have this soft quality. So I was interested that it kind of presented itself as like the idea of voyeurism, rather than being sort of a case of spying.
So the different colors behind, is that, the different colors of them, is that the light behind them?
A little bit, yeah, because I did have different light tones, but also I manipulated them a little bit on the computer. The first little building I made is the one on the far right, and it was very red, and I was interested in these tones that were coming out. So because I had all of these images on the computer, I noticed, you know, different apartment windows had different light tones. So for example, for the one that's kind of greenish in the middle, I would pick out the green windows and then maybe enhance the color a little bit.
You separated the individual windows and then put them together.
They're just double-sided tape to the back of plexiglass. So each window, it's kind of like building blocks, and they were just sort of stacked. And when I had my thesis defense, my external committee member, who was great, she's a writer and was at the film department at ExhibitVic. She noticed that she thought it was interesting that there was reflections going on in the floor, and she thought, like, I'm sure you did that on purpose because it's like, you know, the water in Vancouver and the buildings are right there. And I'm like, oh yeah, I did it on purpose. I had no idea. I hadn't even noticed. But and then from that, this is the last series I'll show you. is directly linked to the light piece. It's the same source material, but they're prints made of individual windows, but instead of sort of being concerned with these figures standing in the windows, I was more interested in the absence of figures. And the process behind these images is a bit complicated, but they're sort of linked to their materiality, so I'll try to explain it. It's they're digital images, right? So I didn't have negatives for them, but I wanted to print them in this darkroom with that tube processor. So I printed small versions of them on transparency, and I had inverted them on the computer. So you know how if you take an image into Photoshop, you can just press an invert button and it gives you a negative rather than a positive. So I just printed, like I made my own negatives basically with these little transparencies, and then I put those little negatives into the darkroom enlarger and printed these. And then so what ends up happening, which I didn't realize was going to happen, is that you get this dot pattern that looks kind of like this when you go up close to the images, because you've enlarged this dot pattern from the negative. But what I thought was interesting is that in the print form, these are ink dots, but they're not ink anymore. They're light representations of ink dots. Yeah, but they're made with now light-sensitive material. So I like the idea of taking, taking the image originally, like any image we take with a camera is a result of light, even if it's digital, and then bringing that photograph into a digital process so that it's only ink and it's been removed completely from a light-sensitive process, and then putting it back in the darkroom. So you've kind of got, this back and forth from light to ink to light again. And I was sort of interested in that because I thought it really spoke of the materiality of photography.
You're creating a medium, another medium.
It was interesting to do because it felt very hands-on. And the images to me sort of spoke again of this sort of, like a portal or a space that represents this kind of in-betweenness. And then I mounted the prints on plexiglass and had them sort of sitting on shelves which leaned against the wall. And I think that was just a choice based on, wanting to emphasize the object, like the photograph as an object, and sort of disengage with the idea that the content of a photograph is always in the photo, but rather maybe it's sort of more in the experience of walking through and being with these objects. So I printed 10 of those, and I'd like to do more, but I'd like to do really large ones, and so I'm trying to figure out how.
What's the size on these?
They're only 20-24 because that's as large as my tube is. I'm still grappling with how to make these larger. I'm toying with the idea of bringing them back into a digital format, like scanning these prints and making them again digital and printing them larger, but
It's, your limitation is the printer.
yeah.
It's printing the dots because the printer can only represent a certain amount of dpi.
Right. So I was wondering, I was thinking of maybe scanning the physical prints here so that, the dot pattern would be picked up, and then enlarging it larger so that the dots would even be bigger, but they would be based on these prints, not on their original negatives, if that makes sense. But I haven't done it yet, so I can't say that it would work.
Do you shoot in RAW when you shoot digital?
Not in this case. I shot with a terrible little camera that was really
You
low
should probably
resolution.
find if you shoot in RAW, you'll have a lot better success.
Yeah.
With the enlargement
Of the image, yeah. And in this case, I mean, because they sort of look like, magazine images where you can see that, what do they call it, like a Bend-Aid dot pattern? It's sort of like that. What's that?
Zippo-tone.
Oh, Zippo-tone? Oh, okay. So I don't mind if it, in a larger format, if that's even accentuated, like if there are big dots connecting the whole thing and you have to move far back to kind of put it all together. I wouldn't mind that happening, I just don't know I don't know how it will look yet.
It's funny because that you do that because there's printers out there that will print like 1200 dots per inch. So you could be like writing words with those dots, basically, like in the scale. If you were really savvy, you could
Oh.
have like words embedded into all those dots.
Oh, I see what
You
you
know what I
mean.
mean? So that it has like
So like 1,200
your
dots in a
name,
dot.
like streaking across all of it.
Oh, that's interesting.
In the shadow of the actual image, you know,
Mhm.
like, but it's just coming in and shadowing, but you can't actually see it. But then when you enlarge it like that, you would actually see the font
Huh.
in there, but that's getting a little bit.
That's very tech. I'm very low tech. That sounds interesting though. So anyways, these were the 3 pieces that I presented for my MFA defense. And I thought they all sort of connected. I consider them to be a body of work. And I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
What are you working on now?
I've got a few things started, but I don't know how it will work out. I'm thinking of, I'd like to, experiment a little bit more with video installation and the idea of encompassing an entire room. So I might make a cloud room or something. So I'm working on footage for that. And I'm doing a few more experiments in that color tube processor that they're not really like the sunspots, but sort of similar. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Well, Laura's giving a one-day workshop on pinhole photography, which is a great way to get introduced to working in the darkroom and understanding the role that light plays in terms of looking at images. And that's at the end of the month. And we have a sheet with more information about that workshop. So no questions? Well, it's great hearing all about your process.
Thanks
and
for having me.
it's
Thanks for
good.
coming.
Yeah.